Well, hey everyone, it's Sean again. So welcome back to this video, part two of the ego's use of guilt. And so in part one, remember when I said guilt demands punishment? So remember that phrase, and we can also add sin to that, because guilt and its cousin, sin, demand punishment. And that guilt is buried deep in our mind. And as long as we're not aware of it, we will continue to punish ourselves until we finally are willing to look at it and heal that. So this is the ego's use of guilt is in chapter 5, section 5. And then we'll start off on paragraph 5. The first line is, the guiltless mind cannot suffer. And so Jesus reminds us there, that the only reason we're suffering is because of the guilt. If there were no guilt there, we would not suffer, because the guiltless mind cannot suffer. That would be the holy mind, the whole mind, the mind that is complete, the mind of perfect joy, perfect peace, perfect love. So so that should tell us any kind of suffering, any kind of pain and suffering that we're experiencing here, it's because that guilt is there, and it will continue to experience that suffering until we're finally willing to look at it and heal that. So here's what we said about the ego. The ego believes that by punishing itself, it will mitigate the punishment of God. And it attributes to God a punishing intent, and then takes this intent as its own prerogative, meaning, like, don't worry, God, you don't have to punish me, I'll punish myself. We do a good job of it, and God be like, yeah, hey, I can't compete with that. But that's what we do. We take on that prerogative. Don't worry, God, I will punish myself, so you will look upon me with grace and forgive me of my sins. So am I doing a good job here, God? It's insane. We finally look at it and see what's going on there. God, it's insane. But man, look how clever the ego is at having us believe it, because, as this statement says, it attributes that punishing intent to God, and then takes it on as its own prerogative. So it's like, and so what does the world believe? That, well, most of the world probably believes in a God of punishment, a God of vengeance, a God that is out to get us, that will send us to hell if we disobey him. That's the ego. I mean, that is the God of ego. The ego has, in that sense, has replaced God as God. And look what it does. It's become the God of vengeance, and the God of guilt. And we worship at the altar of guilt and death, and until we finally are willing to recognize that and see what we're doing. Guilt demands punishment. And so that guilt is buried deep in our mind. And that's the incredible power of forgiveness, allows us to finally start to undo that ego mind of guilt. And so Jesus goes on to say, the ego cannot oppose the laws of God any more than you can, but it can interpret them according to what it wants, just as you can. That is why the question, what do you want, must be answered. You are answering it every minute, and every second, and every moment of decision is a judgment that is anything but ineffectual. Its effects will follow automatically until the decision is changed. So the world we see and experience is an outside picture of an inward condition. The secret to salvation is but this: you are doing this unto yourself. And so there's the effects of it. And until we change our mind about that guilt and get on with healing that guilt, and recognize that the whole mind is a mind of innocence, that we'll continue to punish ourselves thinking we're mitigating the punishment of God by doing that. And that's why we find ourselves in all these situations where we have these patterns, patterns of attracting certain people or situations that, that pattern is telling us that's the outside picture of an inward condition. So it's so clever the way the ego does this. But once you finally look at it and see it from what it is, and that involves just stepping back from it and looking at it from the level of the mind, the level of cause, because that's where the cause is. And when we get caught up in the effects, the world of effects, and thinking that this is happening to us, and not recognizing that it's coming from us, That's what we do. We project that guilt onto the world and onto other situations, circumstances, and people, so that we don't have to look at it, take responsibility for it. But once we finally just step back and realize, wow, yeah, you know what, I am doing this to myself, because I keep finding myself in these situations. And, maybe I am punishing myself. So it's time to heal that guilt. So Jesus goes on to say, the Holy Spirit, like the ego, is a decision. Together they constitute all the alternatives the mind can accept and obey. The Holy Spirit and the ego are the only choices open to you. God created one, and so you cannot eradicate it. You made the other, and so you can. In other words, there's the decision. We're either choosing the decision of guilt and punishment, or the decision for innocence and peace. And so that's the only choices we really have. They said God created one, so we cannot eradicate it. It is eternal. That is our eternal creation, as we were created by God, holy, pure, and innocent. The other we made up, a world of separation. It's an illusion, a dream of separation, but we believe in it. We put all of our faith into it, and we follow the ego as our guide and teacher until we finally are willing to recognize it, that this isn't going to be anything other than it always is. We can have our good times followed by not so good times, and then spend all of our time trying to have those good times. And it's always going to be that. That's duality, so that's a decision. So we made it up, and we put all of our faith in that. That path of the ego is a path of punishment. Guilt and sin demand punishment. And so as long as we are putting our faith in that, that's what we're going to experience. So, and that comes from that decision to recognize that there is another decision. That's where we got to step back and go, yeah, there is another path here, another decision I can make, and that's the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit's path for us, the Holy Spirit's plan for our salvation. So whereas the ego's plan for our salvation is always guilt and death and punishment. So it becomes very obvious when we're willing to step back and just look at it as it is, instead of how we want it to be, because that ego's path is what we wish to be true, whereas the Holy Spirit's path is, this is the way it is. And so we can step back as a decision maker and see it as it is, and then the Holy Spirit's path, this is the path of truth. It is always truth. It's always been true. It always will be true. It is constant, consistent, and certain, because it's changeless. That's eternal. So recognizing that it makes all the difference in the world. And Jesus is trying to get us to recognize what we are doing to ourselves, and there is another choice here. So be aware of what the ego is doing, and be aware when you find yourself in these situations where you are punishing yourself, and acknowledge that, you know what, that's coming from my belief that I deserve it. We wouldn't do this to ourselves if we didn't believe we deserved it. And I think I mentioned in the last video, in part 1, that all victims of abuse, underneath all that, they believe they did deserve it. They must have done something wrong, not loved good enough, or weren't worthy, whatever it is. There's a sense that I deserve it. And that's coming from that guilt, that unconscious, deep-seated guilt that we buried in our mind, and that the ego has attributed to God, and God is going to punish us. God, it's so ridiculous, but man, it's clever. So recognize that. And so I think that's all I'm going to talk about in this video. Yep, I'm going to be doing another video on this section too, the ego's use of guilt, because it's so powerful, I think, and important for us to recognize what that guilt is doing in our lives, and that we can choose against it. We can choose for our innocence, and where there is no punishment, there's only the reward of that perfect holiness and peace. So anyway, I hope that's helpful. So just ask the Holy Spirit, ask Jesus for help with this, to recognize it, and continue to practice it. Just keep asking for help, and observe the results. When you make a new decision that, no, I'm not going to do this anymore, I'm going to choose this other path. And let me know what you think about that. If you have any questions, comments about that, or need any kind of clarification, send me a note in the comment section, and I'll see if I can answer it for you, okay? Anyway, have a great day. Y'all be good to each other, okay? And I'll see you in the next video.